A kind pastor finds a lost, mute boy on a cold, dark night. But when the boy finally speaks, he reveals a shocking truth. His sister has been kidnapped, and they're being hunted by a dangerous man. As the pastor uncovers a chilling web of lies, secrets, and a criminal ring, she must risk everything to protect them. But can she outsmart a relentless predator who will stop at nothing to get the children back? Stay tuned for a heart-pounding journey of love, courage, and the fight for justice. It was a cold, moonless night in the small, quiet town of Willow Creek, Tennessee. The wind howled through the empty streets, rustling the last few leaves, clinging desperately to the old oak trees, lining the sidewalks. Pastor Eliza Rivers pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, shivering slightly as she made her way home from the church. The evening service had ended hours ago, but she had stayed late to tidy up, as she often did. The peaceful silence of the town felt comforting, like a familiar old blanket. Eliza had always loved these late-night walks. It gave her time to reflect, to pray, and to listen for the still, small voice of God. Tonight, however, there was a strange feeling in the air, something she couldn't quite place. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As she turned onto Main Street, she noticed something unusual. There, by the side of an abandoned gas station, was a small figure, huddled against the cold brick wall. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. It was a child, a little boy, all alone, shivering in the biting wind. "Oh, dear Lord," Eliza whispered, quickening her pace. The boy looked up, startled, his big brown eyes wide with fear. His clothes were dirty and torn, his face smeared with tears and grime. He couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. "Hey there, sweetheart," Eliza said gently, crouching down to his level. Her voice soft and filled with concern. "Are you okay? What's your name?" The boy just stared at her, his lips quivering, but he didn't make a sound. Eliza could see the fear in his eyes, deep, raw fear. It was the kind of fear she had seen before, in the faces of people who had been through unspeakable things. "My name is Eliza," she continued, keeping her voice calm and soothing. "I'm a pastor here in town. It's okay. You're safe now." For a moment the boy hesitated, his gaze darting around as if he were looking for something, or someone. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "Aiden?" Eliza's heart broke at the sound of his tiny voice. "Aiden? That's a beautiful name," she said, offering him a warm smile. "Where are your parents, Aiden? Are you lost?" At the mention of parents, Aiden's eyes welled up with tears. He hugged his knees tighter to his chest, burying his face in his arms. Eliza felt a pang of sadness wash over her. Whoever this boy was, whatever had happened to him, she could tell that he was alone and scared. "It's okay, honey," Eliza said softly, reaching out her hand. "You don't have to say anything right now, but it's too cold to stay out here. Why don't you come with me? I'll get you something warm to eat, and you can rest for a while." Aiden looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Hope, perhaps? He glanced around one last time, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. His small fingers felt like ice against her warm palm. "That's it, sweetheart," Eliza whispered, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "Let's get you out of this cold." They walked together in silence, Eliza's mind racing with questions. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? And why was he all alone on a night like this? But she knew better than to press him for answers now. He needed time, and he needed to feel safe. Eliza's house was just a few blocks away, a modest little cottage that she had inherited from her parents. It wasn't much, but it was cozy and warm, a place that had always felt like home. As they approached, she noticed Aiden pulling back slightly, his eyes darting towards the street as if he were afraid someone might see him. "It's okay, Aiden," she said softly. "This is my home. You're safe here." He nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Eliza opened the front door, and a wave of warmth greeted them, carrying the comforting scent of vanilla candles and fresh pine. She led Aiden inside, closing the door gently behind them. "You must be freezing," she said, shrugging off her coat and draping it over his thin shoulders. "Come on, let's get you something warm to eat." She guided him to the kitchen, where she quickly prepared a bowl of hot soup. Aiden sat at the table, his eyes wide, as he watched her move about the room. He looked so small and vulnerable, sitting there in her oversized coat, clutching the fabric like it was a lifeline. Eliza set the bowl in front of him and mimed eating with a spoon. "Go ahead, sweetheart, it's okay. You must be hungry." Aiden hesitated for a moment, then slowly picked up the spoon. He took a tentative sip, and then another, his movements careful and deliberate, as if he weren't used to eating a hot meal. Eliza watched him, her heart aching. What kind of life had this child led to make him so wary of something as simple as food? As he ate, she noticed his eyes drifting towards the window, scanning the dark street outside. Every time a car passed, he flinched, his whole body tensing up. It was as if he were expecting something bad to happen, like he was waiting for someone. "Aiden," Eliza said softly, reaching across the table to gently touch his hand. He flinched at her touch, but didn't pull away. "It's just us here. You're safe. No one can hurt you now." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with such a deep, raw sadness that it nearly took her breath away. "Tori," he whispered, his voice so soft she almost didn't hear it. "Tori?" Eliza repeated, frowning slightly. "Is that someone you know?" Aiden's face crumpled, and for the first time he burst into tears. He cried silently, his small shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. Eliza's heart broke for him. She got up from her chair and wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as he wept. "It's okay," she murmured, rubbing his back gently. "You're safe now, Aiden. I promise." The boy clung to her, his tears soaking through her sweater. She held him tighter, whispering a silent prayer for strength, for wisdom, and for whatever it was that had brought this child to her doorstep tonight. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a distant warning. Eliza glanced towards the street, her heart heavy, with an inexplicable sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, that whatever Aiden was running from hadn't finished with him yet. And as she tucked him into the spare bed that night, watching him drift off into a fitful sleep, she made a silent vow. Whatever it took, she would protect this boy. She would keep him safe, no matter what. But deep down, she knew this was the start of something far bigger than she could understand. And she had a feeling that her faith was about to be tested in ways she never imagined. The sun had just begun to rise over Willow Creek, casting a soft golden light through the kitchen window. Pastor Eliza Rivers watched the rays dance across the old wooden table as she prepared a simple breakfast. The scent of scrambled eggs and toast filled the small cottage, a comforting aroma that seemed to push back the chill of the morning air. Despite the warmth, she couldn't shake the unease lingering from the previous night. Eliza glanced towards the hallway, where Aiden had disappeared into the spare bedroom. He had slept fitfully, tossing and turning, crying out in his sleep. She had woken several times to the sound of his muffled whimpers, her heart breaking a little more each time. She knew trauma when she saw it, but this was something deeper. It felt like the kind of fear that doesn't fade, no matter how far you run. Eliza's thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of bare feet padding across the floor. She turned to see Aiden standing in the doorway, his small frame silhouetted against the light. He looked even smaller today, his eyes wide and hollow, as if he hadn't really slept at all. "Good morning, Aiden," Eliza said gently, forcing a smile. Did you sleep okay? Aiden didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her, as if he were trying to decide whether he could trust her. Eliza's smile faltered, but she kept her voice light. I made some breakfast. Why don't you come sit down and eat? Slowly, Aiden made his way to the table, his movements hesitant and careful, like a frightened animal, unsure if it was safe. He climbed into the chair, pulling his knees up to his chest. Eliza set a plate of eggs and toast in front of him, then took a seat across the table, watching him carefully. You can eat, sweetheart, she encouraged, miming a bite with her own fork. It's all for you. He picked up the fork with shaking hands, taking a small bite. As he chewed, his eyes darted towards the window, scanning the street outside. Eliza followed his gaze, her own unease growing. It was clear he was looking for something, or someone. What are you looking for, Aiden? She asked softly. Is someone after you? At the question, Aiden froze, the fork clattering against the plate. His face went pale, and his breath hitched, like he was on the verge of panic. Eliza reached across the table, gently touching his hand. It's okay, she whispered. You don't have to tell me right now. Just know that you're safe here. For a moment he just stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. Then, in a voice so small, she almost didn't hear it, he said, They're going to find us. Eliza felt a shiver run down her spine. Who's going to find you, Aiden? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But Aiden didn't answer. He dropped the fork, pushed the plate away, and curled up tighter in his chair, burying his face in his knees. Eliza's heart ached as she watched him. Whoever he was talking about, the mere thought of them, had reduced this sweet child to a trembling ball of fear. She took a deep breath, pushing back her own rising anxiety. It's okay, she said softly. You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. We'll figure it out together. All right? Aiden nodded slightly, but he didn't look up. Eliza knew she needed help, but she couldn't bring herself to call the police, not yet. Something inside her told her that involving the authorities right now would only make things worse. She decided to call the one person she knew she could trust, Sam Caldwell, her oldest friend, and the town's most respected police officer. Eliza picked up the phone and dialed Sam's number. It rang twice before his familiar gruff voice answered. Caldwell here. Sam. It's Eliza, she said, glancing towards Aiden, who was still huddled in his chair. I need your help. I've got a situation. A little boy. I found him last night and he's terrified. He won't tell me much, but something's not right. I don't think he's just lost. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Sam spoke again, his voice was softer, filled with concern. Where are you? At home? Yes. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't do anything until I get there, okay? Okay, Eliza agreed, her voice barely a whisper. She hung up the phone, turning back to Aiden. He was watching her now, his eyes filled with a wary kind of curiosity. That was a friend of mine, she explained gently. His name is Sam. He's a police officer, but he's a good man. He's going to help us. Aiden's eyes widened at the word police, and he shrank back, shaking his head violently. No, no police, he cried, his voice breaking with fear. Hey, it's okay. Eliza rushed over, kneeling down beside him. It's okay, Aiden. Sam's a friend. He's not going to hurt you. I promise. But Aiden wasn't listening. He was crying now, his small body racked with sobs. Eliza wrapped her arms around him, holding him close as he trembled. I'm sorry, she whispered, stroking his hair. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. The sound of a car pulling up outside made Eliza glance towards the window. Sam had arrived, his patrol car idling in the driveway. Eliza took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Aiden, I need to go talk to Sam for just a minute. Okay? I promise I'll be right back. Aiden clung to her for a moment, then slowly let go, curling up tighter in the chair. Eliza gave him one last reassuring squeeze before she got up and made her way to the front door. Sam was already out of the car, his expression serious as he approached. Eliza, he greeted her, his voice low. Where's the boy? In the kitchen, she replied, her voice tight with emotion. Sam. He's terrified. He started crying when I mentioned the police. I think he's running from someone, but I don't know who. Sam frowned, looking past her towards the house. You're sure it's not just a case of a lost kid? Maybe he's just scared because he's been alone for a while. No, Eliza said firmly, shaking her head. It's more than that. He keeps talking about them finding him. Whoever he's afraid of, it's not just in his imagination. Sam nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing in thought. All right, let me talk to him. I'll be gentle. Eliza hesitated, then stepped aside, letting Sam into the house. Aiden was still in the kitchen, sitting stiffly in his chair, his eyes glued to the door. When he saw Sam, he flinched, pressing back against the chair, as if he wished he could disappear. Hey there, buddy, Sam said softly, kneeling down to Aiden's level. My name's Sam. I'm a friend of Eliza's. It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. Aiden didn't respond. He just stared at Sam, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Eliza's heart clenched as she watched the raw fear on the boy's face. She stepped forward, placing a hand on Sam's shoulder. Maybe we should give him some time, she suggested quietly. Sam looked back at her, then nodded. All right, he said, standing up. We'll take it slow. As they stepped out of the kitchen, Eliza felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. She had seen many people in need throughout her years as a pastor. But this was different. This was a child, scared and broken, running from something she couldn't yet see. She glanced back at Aiden, her heart aching. Whatever this boy had faced, whatever nightmare he had lived through, she knew it was far from over. And as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows like a distant warning, Eliza had the sinking feeling that whatever was coming next would test her faith like never before. The morning light streamed through the thin curtains in the kitchen, casting a warm glow on the worn wooden table. Pastor Eliza Rivers sat across from Aiden, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, as if the warmth could chase away the chill of unease she felt deep inside. Aiden was quiet, nibbling on a piece of toast with small, careful bites. He glanced up at her occasionally, his dark eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and fear. Sam Caldwell's visit had left Aiden shaken. He hadn't spoken another word since Sam left, retreating back into the silence that Eliza had come to recognize as his protective shield. She knew this silence well. It was the kind that spoke volumes without saying a word. It reminded her of the children she had met on mission trips in war-torn countries, kids who had seen too much, heard too much, and learned too early that silence was safer. Eliza sighed softly, setting her coffee cup down. Aiden, she said gently, trying to catch his gaze. Would you like to play a game today? Maybe we can do a little drawing? He looked up at her then, a flicker of interest in his eyes. She had noticed that he seemed to enjoy drawing, often scribbling small figures on napkins or scraps of paper when he thought she wasn't looking. I have some colored pencils, she continued, smiling warmly. You can draw whatever you want. I'd love to see it. Aiden hesitated, then gave a small nod. It was a tiny gesture, but to Eliza, it felt like a victory. A small crack in the wall he had built around himself. She retrieved the pencils and a stack of paper from the drawer, placing them gently in front of him. There you go, she said softly. Draw whatever makes you happy. Aiden picked up a blue pencil, holding it delicately between his fingers. He glanced at Eliza, as if to make sure it was really okay, then lowered his head and began to draw. Eliza watched him in silence, her heart aching with a mixture of love and worry. He seemed so small, so fragile, hunched over the table like that. As the minutes passed, Aiden's focus deepened. His small hand moved quickly, sketching lines and shapes with surprising precision. Eliza couldn't help but smile. It was the most relaxed that she had seen him since he arrived. "What are you drawing, sweetheart?" she asked softly, leaning in a little closer. Aiden paused, his hand hovering over the page. He seemed to consider her question carefully before finally lifting the paper for her to see. It was a picture of two children holding hands, a boy and a girl. The boy had dark hair, like Aiden's, and the girl's hair was lighter, with curls. They stood under a big tree, with the sun shining brightly above them. But there, in the background, was a dark, looming figure, its face shadowed and indistinct. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. "Who is this?" she asked gently, pointing to the girl. Aiden's lip quivered, and he whispered, "Tori." Eliza's heart sank. There it was again. That name. The name he had cried out in his sleep. The name scribbled on the note in his pocket. "And the person in the back?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Aiden didn't look up. He pressed the pencil hard against the paper, scribbling over the shadowy figure until it was nothing but a dark blur. "Bad man," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Eliza reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "Aiden, honey, who is the bad man? Is he the one you're afraid of?" Aiden nodded slowly, tears welling up in his eyes. He dropped the pencil, pulling his knees up to his chest, and hugged them tightly. "He took her," he whispered, his voice breaking. "He took Tori." Eliza felt her breath catch in her throat. Her worst fears were being confirmed. Whoever this man was, he was the reason Aiden was running, the reason he was so terrified. And Tori, whoever she was, might still be out there, lost or worse. "I'm so sorry, Aiden," Eliza whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She moved closer, wrapping her arms around him as he trembled. "We're going to find her, okay? I promise. We'll find Tori." Aiden clung to her, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Eliza held him tight, her heart breaking for the pain he had been forced to carry. She had to help him. She couldn't let him face this alone. After a while, Aiden's sobs quieted, and he pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked up at Eliza, his gaze filled with a glimmer of hope she hadn't seen before. "You really think we can find her?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eliza nodded, giving him a reassuring smile. "Yes, sweetheart, I do. But I'm going to need your help. Can you tell me more about what happened? Anything you remember?" Aiden hesitated, then nodded slowly. "We were hiding," he began, his voice small and shaky. "In a big building, with lots of boxes. It was cold, and Tori was scared. I told her to be quiet, but the man, he found us anyway." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. She could see the memory playing out in his mind, the terror etched on his face as he relived it. "He grabbed her," Aiden continued, his voice breaking. He said she belonged to him now, and then he pushed me away and told me to run." Eliza felt a rush of anger, unlike anything she had experienced before. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to shout, to scream at the injustice of it all. How could anyone do this to a child? "Did you see his face?" she asked, keeping her voice as calm as she could manage. Aiden shook his head. "No," he whispered. "It was dark. But he had a scar. A big scar on his hand." Eliza filed that detail away in her mind. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in a case like this, Even the smallest clue could make a difference. "Thank you for telling me, Aiden," she said gently, squeezing his hand. "You're so brave. I know that must have been hard." He gave a small nod, looking down at the drawing he had made. "Will you help me find her?" he asked, his voice trembling with hope and fear. Eliza felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Yes, Aiden," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "I promise. We'll find Tori." The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that lingers after a storm. Eliza rocked him gently, whispering prayers for strength, for guidance, and for Tori, wherever she was. As the morning wore on, Eliza knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She needed help, and not just from Sam. She needed someone who could dig deeper, someone with experience in cases like this. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, smooth and professional. "Detective Kate Morales speaking." "Kate, it's Eliza," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "I need your help. It's about a little boy I found. His name is Aiden, and he's looking for his sister." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Kate spoke again, her voice was softer, filled with a concern Eliza hadn't expected. "Tell me everything." And so, Eliza did. She told Kate about Aiden, about the drawing, about the man with the scar. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Kate said firmly. "And Eliza, we're going to find her. I promise." Eliza hung up the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked over at Aiden, who was sitting quietly at the table, his eyes wide with fear and hope. "We're going to find her, Aiden," she said softly, kneeling down beside him. "Detective Kate is going to help us. We're not alone in this." Aiden nodded, his small hand slipping into hers. "I trust you," he whispered. Eliza felt a tear slip down her cheek as she squeezed his hand. "We're going to bring her home," she promised, "no matter what it takes." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter of their journey to unfold. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the small cottage where Pastor Eliza Rivers sat, her heart heavy with the weight of the promise she had made. The morning air was crisp, but the chill Eliza felt had nothing to do with the weather. It was the fear she had seen in Aiden's eyes, the raw, unfiltered terror of a child who had lived through something unimaginable. It clung to her, refusing to let go. She couldn't wait any longer. Eliza knew that if she was going to help Aiden find his sister Tori, she had to act quickly. The memory of the shadowy figure in Aiden's drawing, the man with the scar, haunted her thoughts. She had never seen Aiden so terrified, and that image was now burned into her mind. Sitting at the kitchen table, Eliza dialed the number for Detective Kate Morales, the seasoned investigator she had called earlier. Kate had been a friend for years, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had made a name for herself by solving some of the most difficult cases in the region. If anyone could help them, it was Kate. "Morales here," the detective answered, her voice brisk and professional. "It's Eliza," the pastor said, her voice wavering slightly. "Aiden told me more about what happened. He mentioned a man with a scar on his hand. He said this man took Tori." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Kate spoke again, her tone had softened. "Eliza, I'm on my way. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't let anyone in until I get there. We don't know who we're dealing with yet." Eliza agreed, hanging up the phone with a shaky breath. She glanced over at Aiden, who was sitting on the couch, clutching a small stuffed animal she had given him. His eyes were distant, as if he were somewhere far away, trapped in memories he couldn't escape. "Aiden," she said softly, kneeling down in front of him. "Detective Kate is coming. She's going to help us find Tori." But I need you to be brave, okay? Can you do that for me? Aiden looked at her, his small face pale and drawn. He nodded slowly, squeezing the stuffed animal tighter against his chest. I can try, he whispered, his voice laced with uncertainty. Eliza gave him a reassuring smile, even though her heart was breaking inside. That's all I ask, sweetheart. Just try. A knock at the door made them both jump. Eliza's pulse quickened as she glanced through the peephole, relief flooding her when she saw Kate's familiar face on the other side. She opened the door quickly, letting the detective inside. Kate Morales was a tall, imposing woman with sharp features and a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through you. Today her expression was softer, though still filled with the intensity of someone who had dealt with more than her fair share of pain and loss. Eliza, she greeted, pulling the pastor into a brief hug before looking down at Aiden. And this must be Aiden. She crouched down, meeting his gaze head on. Hi there, buddy. I'm Kate. Eliza tells me you've been very brave. Aiden looked up at her, his eyes filled with a cautious sort of hope. He didn't say anything, but he didn't flinch away either. A small victory, Eliza thought. Kate pulled out a small notepad from her pocket, flipping it open. Aiden, I'm going to ask you some questions about what happened. It's okay if you don't want to answer right now, but anything you can tell me will help us find your sister. Can you do that? Aiden hesitated, glancing back at Eliza, who gave him an encouraging nod. It's okay, sweetheart, she said softly. You're safe here. Taking a deep breath, Aiden nodded. Okay, he whispered. Kate gave him a reassuring smile. Good boy. Now you mentioned a man. A bad man with a scar. Can you tell me what else you remember about him? Anything at all? Aiden bit his lip, his small hands twisting the fabric of his shirt. He had a deep voice, he said slowly. And he smelled like smoke, like when people burn things. Kate scribbled down notes quickly, her brow furrowed in concentration. That's very helpful, Aiden. You're doing great. Do you remember where you were when he took Tori? Aiden's face crumpled at the mention of his sister's name. It was a big place, he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. There were lots of boxes. It was cold, and there was no light. I told her to hide. But he found us. Eliza felt her chest tighten as she listened. She could almost see the scene playing out in her mind. Two small children, huddled together in a dark, freezing warehouse, trying to stay hidden from a monster they couldn't escape. You're doing so well, Aiden, Kate said gently, reaching out to squeeze his hand. You're helping us a lot. Now this is important. Do you remember how you got away? How did you escape? Aiden closed his eyes, his face twisted in pain as he relived the memory. He pushed me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He pushed me away and told me to run. He said he didn't need me. Eliza felt a tear slip down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away. She needed to be strong for him. She couldn't break down now, not when he needed her the most. Kate stood up slowly, her face etched with worry. She pulled Eliza aside, lowering her voice so Aiden couldn't hear. This is worse than I thought, she said, her tone grim. If this man took Tori and let Aiden go, it's possible he was only interested in one child. We might be dealing with a trafficking case. Eliza's blood ran cold. A trafficking case, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You mean human trafficking? Kate nodded, her expression hardening. It's a possibility we can't ignore. We need to act fast. I'm going to make some calls, get a team together. We'll start by checking abandoned buildings and warehouses in the area. If we're lucky, we might find a lead. Eliza nodded, her mind racing. What can I do to help? Stay with Aiden, Kate replied firmly. He trusts you. Keep him calm, and try to get him to remember anything else. Names, places, sounds. Anything could be a clue. Eliza swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Okay, she agreed. Just, please find her, Kate. Bring her back. Kate gave her a tight, reassuring smile. I will, Eliza. I promise. The detective left, and Eliza turned back to Aidan, who was sitting quietly on the couch, his face buried in the stuffed animal. She walked over and knelt down beside him, wrapping her arms around his small frame. They're going to find her, she whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. We're going to bring her home. Aidan didn't say anything, but he hugged her back, his small body trembling against hers. They sat there together in silence, the weight of the unspoken fears hanging heavy in the air. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Eliza kept Aidan close, trying to distract him with stories and games, but she could see the fear lurking behind his eyes. He was trying to be brave, but he was just a child. And Eliza knew that no amount of words could make him feel safe when his sister was still out there, lost and alone. Just as the sun began to set, casting a deep orange glow across the living room, the phone rang. Eliza's heart leapt into her throat as she picked it up. Eliza, Kate's voice crackled through the receiver. We found something? Eliza's hands shook as she gripped the phone tighter. What is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. There's an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, Kate said urgently. We found a piece of fabric, pink, like the dress Aidan described Tori wearing. We're bringing in a search team now, but I need you to keep Aidan calm. We might have found where she was being held. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of hope and dread, swelling inside her. Is she there? Did you find Tori? We don't know yet, Kate replied. But we're not giving up until we do. I'll call you as soon as I have more information. Eliza hung up the phone, turning back to Aidan. He was watching her intently, his small face filled with a desperate, pleading hope. Did they find her? He asked, his voice trembling. Eliza knelt down, taking his hands in hers. They're looking, sweetheart, she said softly. They found something that might belong to Tori. They're going to bring her home. I promise. Aidan's eyes filled with tears, but this time there was a glimmer of hope, shining through the fear. He threw his arms around Eliza, clinging to her, as if she were the only thing keeping him afloat. Thank you, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Thank you for not giving up on her. Eliza held him tight, her own tears slipping down her cheeks. I would never give up on her, she whispered back, or on you. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into darkness, Eliza sent up a silent prayer for strength. Whatever lay ahead, she knew they were just beginning to uncover a much darker truth. The sky had turned a bruised shade of gray by the time the call came in. Pastor Eliza Rivers sat at the kitchen table, her fingers interlaced, her knuckles white, as she clenched her hands together. She had been praying for hours, whispering the same plea over and over again. Please let Tori be okay. Please keep her safe. Aidan sat across from her, the small stuffed animal she'd given him clutched tightly in his arms. He hadn't spoken much since the phone call from Detective Kate Morales. The hope that had flickered in his eyes was now mingled with fear, a fear so deep and raw it was almost palpable. Do you think they found her? He asked suddenly, his voice small and hesitant, as if he were afraid to even utter the question. Eliza took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. I don't know, sweetheart, she said gently. But Kate is doing everything she can, and so are the other officers. We have to trust that they'll find her. Aidan nodded, but the look on his face said he wasn't convinced. He lowered his head, hugging the stuffed animal closer. Eliza's heart broke a little more as she watched him. This child had been through so much, more than anyone should ever have to endure. And yet here he was, fighting to hold on to hope. The phone rang, slicing through the tense silence. Eliza jumped up, her pulse racing as she grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" she said breathlessly. "It's Kate," came the voice on the other end. "Eliza, we found something. I need you to bring Aiden down to the station. It's important." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "What did you find? Is it Tori?" "We don't know yet," Kate replied, her tone urgent but measured. "But we found something significant. A lead. It's best if you both come in. We need Aiden's help." Eliza glanced at the little boy, sitting at her table, his wide eyes locked on her face, searching for any hint of news. "All right. We'll be there as soon as we can." She hung up the phone and knelt down beside Aiden, her expression softening. "We're going to the police station," she explained gently. "Detective Kate needs your help. They found something that might help us find Tori." Aiden's eyes widened, and he nodded quickly, scrambling out of his chair. "I want to help," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of determination and fear. "I need to help her." Eliza took his hand, squeezing it tightly as she led him out the door. The drive to the police station felt like it took hours, even though it was only a few miles away. The tension in the car was thick, the kind that made the air feel heavy. Eliza kept glancing over at Aiden, who sat stiffly in his seat, his small fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. When they arrived, Kate Morales was already waiting for them in the lobby. She looked more serious than Eliza had ever seen her, her usual sharp expression tinged with something softer, something like sympathy. "Thank you for coming," Kate said, bending down to Aiden's level. "I know this is hard, buddy, but you're doing an amazing job. You're so brave." Aiden swallowed hard, nodding but not saying a word. He glanced up at Eliza, who gave him a reassuring smile. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm right here with you." Kate led them down a narrow hallway to a small room with a long table and a few chairs. On the table was a folder, thick with papers and photographs. Kate gestured for them to sit down, then took a seat across from them. "We found this at the warehouse," she said, opening the folder and spreading out the contents. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she saw the photos, pictures of children, some of them bruised and dirty, all of them looking scared and lost. Aiden's face went pale. He stared at the pictures, his eyes wide with recognition. "That's her," he whispered, pointing to a photo of a little girl with light brown curls and a small, frightened face. "That's Tori." Eliza felt her heart shatter. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the photo. It was Tori, just as Aiden had described her, but she looked so different from the happy, smiling girl he had drawn in his picture. Here she looked thin and scared, her eyes hollow. Kate leaned forward, her expression gentle. "Aiden, do you remember where you were when this picture was taken? Do you remember anything about the place?" Aiden closed his eyes, his face twisted with concentration. "It was dark," he said slowly. "There were lots of boxes, and it smelled bad, like chemicals." Eliza's stomach turned. She had heard stories of places like this, hidden warehouses where terrible things happened, where children were kept like objects, used and discarded by people who saw them as nothing more than commodities. "We also found this," Kate continued, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a flyer for a local shipping company, the kind you might find on a bulletin board or a street corner. "This was stuffed into one of the boxes. The company has a warehouse on the edge of town, not far from where we found Aiden." Eliza felt a surge of hope. "Do you think that's where she is?" Kate's expression was grim. "It's possible. We're sending a team there now to check it out. But I need to ask Aiden one more question." She turned to the boy, her voice gentle but firm. "Aiden, do you remember if there were any sounds? Anything that could help us figure out where you were?" Aiden bit his lip, his eyes filling with tears. There was a loud noise, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Like a big machine. It kept going on and off. And I heard someone talking. They said she was worth a lot. Eliza felt her breath leave her in a rush, as if she had been punched in the gut. She looked at Kate, her eyes wide with horror. Worth a lot? She repeated, her voice shaking. They're selling her? Kate's face was a mask of controlled fury. That's what it sounds like, she said quietly. If that's the case, we don't have much time. Aiden broke down then, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Eliza pulled him into her arms, holding him close, her own tears flowing freely. It's okay, Aiden, she whispered, stroking his hair. We're going to find her. I promise. We won't stop until we bring her home. Kate stood up, her expression hardening with resolve. I need to go, she said. I'm heading to the warehouse with the team. I'll call you as soon as I have news. Eliza nodded, unable to find her voice. She just held Aiden tighter, praying with every fiber of her being that they would find Tori before it was too late. The next few hours were a blur of tension and silence. Eliza sat in the waiting room of the police station, her arms wrapped protectively around Aiden. The little boy had fallen into a fitful sleep, his small body still trembling from the aftershocks of his sobs. Eliza's phone buzzed, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was Kate. Eliza, Kate said, her voice breathless. We found her. Eliza's heart leapt into her throat. Is she okay? Is Tori all right? She's alive, Kate replied, her voice cracking with emotion. We're bringing her in now. She's scared, but she's asking for her brother. She kept saying his name. Aiden. Eliza felt her knees go weak. She sank into a chair, clutching the phone to her ear. Oh, thank God, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Kate. Thank you. We'll be back at the station in 10 minutes, Kate said. You need to prepare Aiden. It's going to be emotional. Eliza hung up, turning to the little boy in her arms. She gently shook him awake, brushing a strand of hair away from his face. Aiden, she said softly, wake up, sweetheart. I have good news. Aiden's eyes fluttered open, filled with the haze of sleep and confusion. What? What is it? They found her, Eliza said, her voice choked with tears of joy. They found Tori. She's okay. And she's coming here. Aiden stared at her, as if he couldn't believe the words he was hearing. They found her? He whispered, his voice trembling. Eliza nodded, pulling him into a tight embrace. Yes, sweetheart. They found her. You're going to see your sister again. Aiden's face crumpled, and he sobbed into her shoulder. But this time they were tears of relief. Tears of a little boy who had been lost and scared for so long, but had finally found his way back to hope. Outside, the first rays of the setting sun pierced through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the town. It felt like the whole world was exhaling a sigh of relief, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. And as Eliza held Aiden close, whispering reassurances in his ear, she knew that their journey was far from over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the stirrings of hope, fragile but real, blooming in her heart. The police station was a flurry of activity as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Pastor Eliza Rivers stood by the front desk, her heart pounding in her chest as she held tightly onto Aiden's small hand. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of relief and anxiety, as they waited for Detective Kate Morales to return with Tori. Aiden was shaking, his fingers wrapped around Eliza's with a grip that was almost painful. He hadn't spoken since Eliza told him the news, his eyes darting around the room, like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Eliza knelt down beside him, her heart aching at the fear and uncertainty etched across his small face. "She's coming, Aiden," Eliza whispered, brushing a strand of hair out of his eyes. "You're going to see your sister again." Aiden bit his lip, his eyes welling up with tears. What if she's mad at me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I ran away. I left her behind." Eliza's chest tightened with emotion. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "No, sweetheart," she said firmly. "You did everything you could. You were so brave. And I know Tori isn't mad at you. She's been waiting for you, just like you've been waiting for her." Aiden's lip quivered, and he nodded slowly, though the doubt still lingered in his eyes. Eliza pulled him into a hug, holding him close, as they both waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. Finally, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Eliza looked up, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Kate approaching. Her arm wrapped around a small girl with light brown curls and a tear-streaked face. "Tori," Aiden whispered, his voice breaking. He took a step forward, his entire body trembling. The little girl looked up, her wide, fearful eyes locking onto her brother's face. For a moment the world seemed to stop. Then, with a sob that shattered the silence, Tori broke free from Kate's grasp and ran towards Aiden, her arms outstretched. "Aiden," she cried, her voice filled with a mix of relief and desperation. Aiden ran to her, meeting her halfway. He wrapped his arms around her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. "Tori," he choked out, his voice muffled by her hair. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to leave you. I tried to come back. Shh," Tori whispered, her small hands clutching at the back of his shirt, as if she were afraid he might disappear. "It's okay, Aiden. I'm not mad. I was so scared. But I'm not mad. I just wanted you to come back." Eliza stood back, tears streaming down her face as she watched the siblings cling to each other, sobbing like their hearts were breaking. It was the most beautiful, heartbreaking thing she had ever seen. For all the pain they had been through, for all the fear and uncertainty, in this moment, they had each other again. And that was all that mattered. Kate approached Eliza, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We found her in the back room of the warehouse," she said quietly. "She was alone, but she kept asking for Aiden. She wouldn't stop crying until we told her we were bringing her here." Eliza nodded, swallowing hard, against the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Kate," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means." Kate gave her a small, tight smile. "I do," she replied. "And we're not done yet. We still have to find the man who did this, the one Aiden described. But right now, I thought these two needed this moment." Eliza nodded again, wiping her eyes as she looked back at the children. Aiden had pulled back slightly, his hands framing Tori's face, as if he couldn't believe she was real. "You're okay?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and fear. "He didn't hurt you?" Tori shook her head, though her eyes filled with fresh tears. "I'm okay now," she said. "I was scared, but I knew you'd come for me." Aiden hugged her again, tighter this time, as if he were trying to make up for every second they had been apart. "I'm never leaving you again," he promised. "Never." Eliza stepped forward, gently placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "Let's go home," she said softly. "You both need to rest. We can talk more tomorrow." Tori looked up at her, a flicker of fear passing across her face. Are you taking us back to him?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eliza's heart broke all over again. "No, sweetheart," she said firmly. "You're safe now. I'm taking you to my home, and I promise no one is going to hurt you ever again." The morning sun had just begun to filter through the curtains when Eliza Rivers awoke. For a brief, blissful moment, she forgot everything. The fear, the pain, the endless questions. But then reality came crashing back, and her heart ached with the weight of it all. Upstairs, she could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of Aiden and Tori, still fast asleep after their long, emotional night. Eliza slipped out of bed quietly, pulling on her robe and making her way downstairs. She needed a moment to herself, a chance to gather her thoughts before the day's chaos began again. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. The simple act of preparing tea was comforting, a small piece of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. The sound of the kettle boiling was the only noise in the house, until a light knock at the front door broke the silence. Eliza frowned, her hand pausing mid-reach for the teapot. It was barely dawn, too early for visitors. Cautiously, she made her way to the door and peeked through the small window. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw Detective Kate Morales standing on the porch, looking more disheveled and exhausted than ever before. Eliza quickly unlocked the door and ushered her inside. "Kate, what's going on?" Eliza asked, her voice hushed. Kate stepped inside, her face a mask of grim determination. "We need to talk," she said. "I didn't want to call. You deserve to hear this in person." Eliza's stomach twisted. "Is it about Tori? Is she in danger again?" Kate shook her head, running a hand through her dark hair. "No, it's not that. But I've been digging into Aiden and Tori's past. There's something you need to know." Eliza felt a wave of nausea wash over her. "Tell me," she whispered. Kate gestured towards the kitchen table, pulling out a folder from her bag as she sat down. "I ran a background check on Aiden and Tori, using the information Aiden gave us about the man who took Tori, the one with the scar on his hand. It took some time, but we found a match." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. "Who is he?" Kate flipped open the folder, revealing a mugshot of a man with sharp, angular features and a jagged scar running across the back of his left hand. "His name is Victor Marlowe," she said. "He's got a long record: assault, kidnapping, human trafficking. He's been on our radar for years, but we've never been able to pin anything on him. He's careful, covers his tracks." Eliza stared at the photo, a chill running down her spine. "He's the one who took Tori?" Kate nodded grimly. "Yes. And he's not working alone. He's part of a larger ring, one that targets vulnerable children, like Aiden and Tori." Eliza's blood ran cold. "A trafficking ring?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes," Kate replied, "and it's worse than we thought. I believe that whoever was supposed to be looking after Aiden and Tori before, whether it was their parents, a guardian, or a foster system, either failed them or was involved. This isn't a random kidnapping. These kids were targeted." Eliza's hands shook as she clasped them together. "What do we do now? How do we keep them safe?" Kate leaned forward, her voice urgent. "We need to move quickly. Victor Marlowe won't stop looking for Tori. He's already lost her once, and if he finds out she's with you, he'll come back. We need to put both of them into protective custody until we can take down the entire operation." "No," Eliza said firmly, shaking her head. "I won't put them through that. They've been through enough already. They need stability, not more fear and uncertainty." Kate's expression softened. "I understand, Eliza. I do. But if we don't act now, they could be taken again. You have to realize how serious this is." Eliza stood up, pacing the small kitchen as she tried to make sense of everything. "There has to be another way," she insisted. "Something we can do to protect them without uprooting their entire lives." Kate was silent for a moment, watching Eliza with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. There might be one option, she said slowly. But it's risky. Eliza stopped pacing, turning to face her. Tell me. We could go public, Kate said. Expose Victor Marlowe and his operation. It would put pressure on him, make it harder for him to move without being noticed. But it would also mean putting Aiden and Tori's story out there, making them more visible. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. You mean, tell their story? In the media? Kate nodded. It's a double-edged sword. It could draw attention to them, but it could also bring them the help they need. People might come forward with information, tips, sightings of Marlowe and his associates. It could be the break we've been waiting for. Eliza sank down into the chair, her head spinning. It was a terrifying thought. Making the children's story public, putting their faces on the news for the whole world to see. But what choice did they have? They couldn't keep running forever. I need to talk to Aiden and Tori, she said finally. It has to be their decision. Kate nodded, closing the folder and slipping it back into her bag. Of course. But we need to decide quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this becomes. Eliza took a deep breath, steeling herself. I'll wake them. She climbed the stairs slowly, her heart heavy with the burden of what she was about to ask. In the guest room, she found Aiden and Tori, still curled up together, their small faces relaxed in sleep. For a moment, she simply watched them, her heart aching with love and fear. They looked so peaceful, innocent like any other children. It was easy to forget, just for a second, the horrors they had endured. Aiden? Tori? Eliza whispered, kneeling beside the bed and gently shaking them awake. Sweethearts, I need you to wake up. We have something important to talk about. Aiden was the first to stir, blinking sleepily as he sat up. Tori followed a moment later, rubbing her eyes. What is it? She mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. Eliza took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Detective Kate is downstairs. She found out who took you, Tori. His name is Victor Marlowe, and he's a very bad man. We need to decide what to do next. Tori's eyes went wide with fear, and she instinctively scooted closer to Aiden. He's going to come back for us, isn't he? She whispered. Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, but she forced herself to stay calm. We won't let that happen, she promised. But we need your help. Kate thinks we should tell your story to the public. It might help us find the people who are working with Marlowe. But it's a big decision, and it could be scary. I won't do it unless you both agree. Aiden looked at Tori, then back at Eliza. You mean everyone would know? He asked, his voice small. Eliza nodded. Yes, it would be on the news, and people would see your pictures. But it might help us find the people who hurt you, and make sure they can't hurt anyone else. Tori squeezed Aiden's hand, her face pale. I don't want him to find us, she said, her voice trembling. But if it helps other kids like us, maybe we should do it. Aiden swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. I'll do it, he said, his voice filled with a quiet, steely determination. If it means keeping Tori safe, I'll do it. Eliza felt a rush of pride, so intense it nearly overwhelmed her. She gathered them both into her arms, holding them tight. You're both so brave, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I'm so proud of you. We'll do this together, and we'll make sure he never hurts anyone again. The three of them made their way downstairs, where Kate was waiting. When she saw the look on their faces, she nodded in understanding. You're sure about this? She asked, her voice gentle. Aiden and Tori nodded together, standing side by side like two tiny warriors facing down a giant. We're sure, Aiden said. We want to help. Kate's eyes softened, and she crouched down to their level, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. You're the bravest kids I've ever met, she said. We're going to tell your story, and we're going to make sure Victor Marlowe and his friends are stopped. I promise you. Eliza watched them, her heart swelling with a fierce, protective love. She knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that would bring challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But as she looked at Aiden and Tori, standing tall and unbroken, despite everything they had faced, she knew they had made the right choice. Together, they were stronger than fear. Together they would shine a light into the darkest corners of the world and bring justice to those who needed it most. And no matter what happened next, Eliza knew they would face it together. The newsroom buzzed with the kind of energy that only came with breaking news. Eliza Rivers sat at the edge of her seat, clutching Aiden's hand in one of hers and Tori's in the other. They were huddled together in a small waiting room, just outside the studio, where they would soon be interviewed live on television. The lights were harsh, and the air was thick with the smell of coffee and stale air conditioning. Aiden looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Are we really going to be on TV?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmur of voices and the hum of equipment. Eliza squeezed his hand gently. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're going to tell your story. It's scary, I know. But you're not alone. I'm right here with you. And so is Tori." Tori nodded, her small hand clutching tightly to her brother's. She looked more fragile than ever, her face pale and her curls frizzy from the nervous sweat that beaded on her forehead. But there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a flicker of strength that Eliza had seen growing ever since the moment they found her. A woman with a headset poked her head through the door, smiling warmly at them. "It's almost time," she said. "We'll bring you in shortly. Just remember, there's nothing to be nervous about. You're in a safe place here." Eliza thanked her. Though her heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her throat. She knew this was the right thing to do. They needed to shine a light on what had happened to Aiden and Tori. They needed to make sure Victor Marlowe could never hurt another child again. But that didn't make it any easier. She knelt down in front of the children, pulling them both into a tight embrace. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You're the bravest kids I know. We're going to help a lot of people today." Tori buried her face in Eliza's shoulder, trembling. "What if he sees us?" she asked, her voice muffled and small. "What if he comes after us again?" Eliza pulled back slightly, cupping Tori's face in her hands. "He won't," she said firmly. "We're going to make sure everyone knows who he is. He won't be able to hide anymore. And we're going to keep you safe. I promise." Aiden nodded, his jaw set in a determined line. "We have to do this," he said, squeezing Tori's hand. "For the other kids, the ones who are still out there." Before Eliza could respond, the door opened again, and the woman with the headset gestured for them to follow her. "We're ready for you," she said. The studio was a whirlwind of lights and cameras, all focused on a sleek desk, where a woman in a bright red blazer sat, her expression serious but kind. Eliza recognized her as Melanie Clark, the news anchor who had agreed to tell their story. She stood up as they approached, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Pastor Eliza, Aiden, Tori," she greeted. "Thank you so much for being here. I know this must be very difficult, but I want you to know that you're safe here. We're going to make sure your story is heard." Eliza gave a small, tense smile as she shook the woman's hand. "Thank you for having us," she replied. "We just want to make sure no one else goes through what they did." Melanie nodded, her expression turning somber. "We're going to do everything we can to help." She guided them to their seats, placing Eliza between the two children. The bright lights were almost blinding, and Eliza could feel the heat of them on her face. She glanced down at Aiden and Tori, giving each of them a reassuring squeeze. "We're live in 3, 2, 1. The red light on the camera blinked on, and Melanie turned to face the lens, her voice filled with a gravity that matched the moment. "Good evening. I'm Melanie Clark, and tonight we have a special and urgent story to share with you. A story that needs to be heard by every parent, every guardian, and every member of our community. Sitting with me today are Pastor Eliza Rivers and two incredibly brave children, Aiden and Tori, who have come forward to share their harrowing experience with the hope of bringing justice and, perhaps, saving lives. Eliza felt the children tense beside her, and she squeezed their hands, giving them a gentle nod. It was time. Pastor Eliza, Melanie continued, turning to her, can you tell us how you first met Aiden and Tori? Eliza took a deep breath, steadying herself. It was a few weeks ago, she began, her voice calm, but laced with emotion. I found Aiden alone. On a cold night, he was scared, hungry, and lost. He wouldn't speak at first, but I knew he needed help. It wasn't until later that I learned he was searching for his sister Tori, who had been taken from him by a man named Victor Marlowe. A ripple of shock seemed to move through the studio, even though everyone there already knew the story. The weight of Eliza's words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Melanie leaned forward, her expression filled with sympathy. Aiden, can you tell us what happened that night? Aiden looked up at Eliza, his eyes wide and filled with tears. She gave him a small nod, encouraging him. He took a deep, shaky breath, then turned back to Melanie. He took Tori, Aiden said, his voice small but clear. We were hiding in a big warehouse, trying to stay quiet. I told her to be still, but he found us. He said she belonged to him now. Aiden's voice cracked, and he quickly wiped at his eyes. Melanie's face softened, and she reached out, gently placing a hand over his. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, Aiden, she said quietly. You're very brave for sharing this with us. Tori squeezed her brother's hand, her own eyes filled with unshed tears. I was so scared, she whispered, her voice trembling. He locked me in a room and said no one would find me. But I kept hoping. I kept hoping Aiden would come for me. Eliza wrapped an arm around Tori, pulling her close. And he did, she said softly. He never gave up. Melanie's voice grew firmer, more urgent. The man who took Tori, Victor Marlowe, is part of a larger operation, one that preys on vulnerable children. By sharing their story today, Aiden and Tori are shining a light on a dark corner of our world. We need your help to bring Marlowe to justice. If you have any information, please call the tip line on your screen. Together, we can put an end to this. The broadcast ended, and the red light on the camera flicked off. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was done. The story was out there now, for better or worse. Melanie turned back to them, her eyes shining with tears. You both did so well, she said, her voice filled with admiration. You're going to help a lot of people. Aiden nodded, a small, hopeful smile, tugging at his lips. I just want to find him, he said quietly. I want to make sure he can't hurt anyone else. Tori looked up at her brother, her eyes filled with a new kind of strength. We're going to be okay now, aren't we? Eliza knelt down in front of them, taking their hands in hers. Yes, sweethearts, she said, her voice filled with conviction. We're going to be okay, and we're going to make sure no one ever hurts you again. The ride home was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence of fear. It was the peaceful quiet that comes after a storm, the kind that feels like the world is catching its breath. The children leaned against Eliza, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, but their faces soft with relief. As they pulled up to the cottage, Eliza felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. They had taken the first step into the light, and she knew there was still a long road ahead. But they weren't alone anymore. They had each other. And now, they had a whole community standing behind them. She helped the children inside, tucking them into bed, with a kiss on each of their foreheads. "Sleep well, my loves," she whispered. "The worst is behind us now." And as she watched them drift off to sleep, their small faces finally peaceful, Eliza knew in her heart that they were one step closer to healing. Whatever came next, they would face it together, and together, they would be unstoppable. The air was crisp and fresh as Pastor Eliza Rivers stepped out onto the porch the next morning. The golden sunlight casting a warm glow over the small garden in front of her cottage. The world felt different today, lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted. The interview had aired last night, and already calls had been pouring in with tips and sightings. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. Inside, she could hear the faint sound of Aiden and Tori's laughter as they played a game at the kitchen table. The sound filled Eliza's heart with joy and relief. It had been too long since she'd heard them laugh like that, free and unburdened. She took a deep breath, savoring the moment. But just as she was about to step back inside, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, frowning when she saw the caller ID. It was Detective Kate Morales. Eliza's heart sank. She had been hoping for good news, but the early morning call felt ominous. "Kate," Eliza answered, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "Eliza, I need you to listen carefully." Kate's voice was low and urgent. "We've got a problem. After the interview aired, we received several credible tips about Victor Marlowe's whereabouts. But it looks like he's already on the move. One of the tips came from someone who claims they saw him not far from your area. Too close for comfort." Eliza's blood ran cold. "He's here? In our town?" "It's possible," Kate replied. "We're mobilizing a team now, but I need you to get the kids out of the house, just in case. Take them somewhere safe, and keep your phone on you. I'll update you as soon as I can." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She turned to look back through the screen door, where Aiden and Tori were still giggling over their game. They had no idea that the man who had stolen their childhood might be closer than ever. "Okay," Eliza said, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her. "I'll get them out of here right now." "Good," Kate said. "And Eliza, be careful." Eliza hung up, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She couldn't let Aiden and Tori see her fear. They needed her to be strong. She stepped inside, forcing a smile as she approached the table. "Hey, you two," she said, her voice light. "How about we go for a little adventure today? There's a park not far from here with a playground. I thought it might be nice to get some fresh air." Aiden looked up, his eyes bright with excitement. "Really?" he asked. "Can we go right now?" Tori hesitated, glancing up at Eliza with a slight frown. "Is something wrong?" she asked quietly. "You look worried." Eliza's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. She knelt down beside Tori, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she said softly. "I just think we could all use a little break. What do you say?" Tori searched her face for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Okay," she agreed. "Let's go." Eliza grabbed her purse and a small bag of snacks, her movements quick and efficient. Her mind raced as she mentally mapped out their route. She needed to keep them away from the main roads, just in case. They couldn't afford to take any risks. "Let's get going," she said, ushering the children out the door and locking it behind them. As they made their way to the car, Eliza couldn't help but glance over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the quiet street for any sign of danger. But everything looked normal, almost eerily so. They drove in silence for the first few minutes, the tension thick in the air. Aiden stared out the window, watching the houses and trees blur past, while Tori fiddled nervously with the hem of her shirt. "Are we really going to the park?" Tori asked suddenly, her voice small. Eliza glanced at her in the rearview mirror, forcing a reassuring smile. "We are," she said. "But we might take the long way, just for fun." Tori didn't look convinced, but she nodded, leaning back against her seat. Eliza felt a pang of guilt. She hated lying to them, but she knew she had no choice. Keeping them safe was the most important thing. As they neared the park, Eliza's phone buzzed again. She pulled over to the side of the road, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Kate. "We've got eyes on Marlowe. He's in the area, but we haven't engaged yet. Stay where you are. Don't go to the park." Eliza's heart sank. She turned in her seat to face the children, her smile now tinged with apology. "Change of plans, kiddos," she said lightly. "How about we go for a drive instead? Maybe we can get some ice cream." Aiden's face lit up at the mention of ice cream, but Tori's expression darkened. "You're lying," she said quietly. "You're trying to keep us away from something." Eliza's heart broke a little at the accusation, but she nodded. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I'm trying to keep you safe. There's someone dangerous nearby. But we're going to be okay. I won't let anything happen to you." Tori's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out for Aiden's hand, squeezing it tightly. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered. "The man who took me?" Eliza swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes," she said, "but Kate and the police are looking for him. They're going to catch him. We just need to stay away for a little while." Aiden's face went pale, and he looked like he might be sick. "He can't take us again," he said, his voice shaking. "We won't let him." Eliza reached back, placing a hand on each of their knees. "No, he won't," she said fiercely. "We're together now, and we're stronger than he is. Do you believe me?" Tori nodded, her tears spilling over as she clung to her brother. "I believe you," she whispered. Eliza took a deep breath, pulling back onto the road. She had no clear destination in mind. She just needed to keep driving, keep them moving, until Kate called back, with the all clear. She drove aimlessly through the back roads, her eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror. Minutes felt like hours as the tension built. Eliza's phone rang again, and she quickly answered it, putting it on speaker. "Eliza, it's Kate." The detective's voice crackled through the line. "We have him in custody. Marlowe's been arrested. He's not going to hurt anyone ever again." Eliza's breath left her in a rush, a sob of relief escaping her lips. "Oh, thank God," she whispered. "Thank you, Kate." Aiden and Tori both looked up, their eyes wide with hope. "He's gone?" Aiden asked. "For real?" "For real," Kate confirmed. "You're safe now, both of you. It's over." Eliza pulled over to the side of the road, turning to face the children. "Did you hear that?" she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's over. You're safe." Tori let out a small, choked sob, throwing her arms around Aiden. He hugged her back, burying his face in her hair as they both cried tears of relief. Eliza watched them, her own tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew they still had a long road ahead. There would be healing to do, scars that would take time to fade. But for the first time, they could truly begin to move forward, free from the shadow that had haunted them for so long. "I love you both so much," Eliza whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And we're going to be okay. Together, we can face anything." The sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light across the car as they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms. It felt like a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to create a life filled with love and safety. And as they drove home, the wind carrying away the last remnants of fear, Eliza knew in her heart that they had found something more powerful than fear or pain. They had found hope,